She refused his hand at the altar. Not the marriage. The marriage was already signed, 11 days earlier, with her father's solicitor at one end of the desk and her name in her own clear hand at the other. She had agreed to become the Duchess of Ravensmere on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with the wax still warm on the seal. What she would not do, on the morning the priest joined them in the cold stone chapel at Ravensmere Hall, was reach for the Duke's hand when he held it out to her. She kept her own hands folded inside her gloves. She let his hand stay in the air between them for the length of one slow breath. Then she lifted her chin and answered the question the priest had asked, and the word was very clear and very final and entirely her own. I will. Adrian Hertford, 8th Duke of Ravensmere, did not look at her face. He had not looked at her face since she walked the length of the aisle. His eyes were on the leaded window above the altar, on the height of it, on the angle of light coming through the green and yellow glass, as though he were measuring something. His hand returned to his side. His ring caught the morning and threw a small, hard flash of gold against the wall. He answered after her, and his voice carried no warmth and no cruelty. It carried nothing at all. I will. She heard the priest pronounce them married. She heard the witnesses move behind her. She heard a footman cough once and stop himself. She did not hear the Duke breathe. When he turned to walk her down the chapel steps, she put her hand on his sleeve. Not in his hand, on his sleeve. Through the dark green wool of his coat, his arm felt like an iron stair railing. Present, useful, untender. She permitted herself one private observation as the chapel doors opened onto the spring morning. He smelled faintly of bergamot, and something colder, something like wet slate, and she would remember that scent for the rest of her life, whether she chose to or not. He did not speak to her on the gravel path back to the hall. He did not speak to her at the breakfast that followed, where his sister and 3 witnesses ate cold ham and toasted his health. And his sister tried twice to engage Eleanor in conversation about the weather and the journey from Hampshire. Eleanor answered each question fully and pleasantly. Her new husband ate 3 pieces of toast, drank 1 cup of coffee, and excused himself before the table was cleared. Estate business, he said, addressing the air above his sister's left shoulder. Mrs. Pell will show the Duchess to her rooms. He did not look at his wife as he said the word, Duchess. He went out through the side door into the stable yard, and Eleanor heard the gravel under his boots fade toward the stables. She heard a horse being saddled. She heard him ride out. She did not see her husband again for 2 days. This was on the 15th of April, 1815. Eleanor counted, from that morning, every day she lived inside the marriage that did not contain her. By the time of the spring ball at Carstairs House, the first ball she attended as Duchess of Ravensmere, in the 3rd week of April the following year, she had counted 371 days. She did not know, on the morning of the wedding, that her husband had memorized her since the first time he saw her across his godfather's drawing room 9 months before the contract was signed. She did not know he had paid attention with the focus a scholar gives a difficult manuscript. She did not know he had decided she was the only woman he could ever marry on the 3rd evening, or that he had also decided he would never let her see him notice. She did not know that the morning he refused to meet her eyes at the altar was the morning he had already stopped sleeping. She knew only that she was alone, that she was cold, and that she would survive it with her name intact. That was the contract she made with herself before her foot left the chapel step. It was the only contract that mattered. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper at Ravensmere Hall, was a small, grey-eyed woman of 50, with a mouth that had learned not to smile in public, and very rarely smiled in private. She walked Eleanor through the principal rooms of the hall on the afternoon of the wedding, her keys clinking softly at her belt, naming each chamber as though reading a list. The blue drawing room, the yellow drawing room, the morning room, the library, His Grace's library, but you are at liberty in it, Your Grace, of course. The gallery, the east staircase, the west wing. Your apartments are this way. Eleanor stopped at the library door. It was open a hand's breadth. She could see a long room with a fire that had been lit and tended, 2 leather chairs, and a desk with a green-shaded lamp standing dark. "His Grace works here?" she asked. "His Grace reads here. His study is the smaller room beyond. He is not in either at present." "What does he read?" Mrs. Pell hesitated. It was a small hesitation, but Eleanor noticed it. "Estate matters, Your Grace. Histories. Some poetry. He has a fondness for the Augustans." "And the unfondness?" Eleanor asked, with a small, quiet smile that surprised the housekeeper into an answering one. "His Grace dislikes the romantics, Your Grace. He has said so." "Then I shall have to bring some down with me," Eleanor said, "from my trunk." She went on through the door before Mrs. Pell could form a reply. She made a note of the green lamp. She made a note of the chair nearest the fire, the leather of its arm worn pale where a hand had rested over and over again. She made a note of a small silver dish on the desk that contained, of all things, 3 perfectly polished river stones. She did not say any of this. She walked on and let Mrs. Pell point out the rest of the rooms, and went up to the apartments that were now hers. That evening, after a supper she ate alone at one end of a polished table long enough to seat 16, she came back down the corridor past the library and found the door open. The fire was lit. The green lamp was lit. Her husband was not there. On the desk, exactly where she would have to pass it on her way to the chair by the fire, lay an open book. It had been left face down with its spine arched. She bent to look at the title. It was a slim octavo volume of Wordsworth. She stood for a long moment with her hand resting on the edge of the desk. Then she straightened and turned the book carefully right side up so that its spine would not crack, and walked out of the library without sitting in the chair. She did not know, then, what to do with the message. She was not even certain it was a message. It might have been a coincidence. It might have been a footman's tidying. It might have been one of his sister's books left absent-mindedly behind on her last visit. She did not yet know that her husband had ridden into the village that afternoon, into a bookshop he visited twice a year, and asked the bookseller for the most reputable edition of Wordsworth currently in print. She would not know that for a great many months. The pattern began the next morning. She came down to breakfast at 8:30, exactly as Mrs. Pell had told her was the Duke's habit, and found the breakfast room empty. A place was set for her. A small silver dish of strawberries, the first of the season, hothouse grown, far too early for the open garden, sat at her place. Beside it stood a tall glass of water with a single, perfect slice of lemon floating in it. She had not asked for either. She had not even mentioned, in her 3 meals so far at Ravensmere Hall, a preference for lemon water. But she had taken it without comment at her father's house every morning of her life because her mother had served it that way before she was lost to them. And Eleanor had continued the habit because abandoning it had felt, somehow, like the abandoning of a small, private prayer. She looked at the lemon. She looked at the strawberries. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, where the Duke's place was set, but uneaten. Toast in the rack, coffee in a covered pot, a folded napkin untouched. "Has His Grace breakfasted, Mrs. Pell?" "His Grace breakfasted at 6:30, Your Grace. He has gone to inspect the south fence." "I see." She sat. She drank the lemon water. She ate 2 strawberries and tried not to think about either. She decided she would test it. She decided she would not say a single word to a single servant about a single preference, and she would observe what happened over the course of a week. By the end of the week, the following had appeared, unannounced, at the appropriate places. Lavender in her dressing room, her favorite scent. A writing desk, turned so that she sat with the morning light over her left shoulder rather than her right. She was left-handed, although her father had labored unsuccessfully for 15 years to break her of it. A footstool covered in plain green linen, rather than the embroidered cream brocade that had been there when she arrived. She preferred plain things. And a particular variety of yellow tea rose, just opening, in the small porcelain vase on her bedside table, every second morning. The yellow rose was, in fact, the variety her grandmother had grown. Eleanor had mentioned that variety, once, to her aunt, in her father's drawing room, 18 months before her wedding, in a conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes. The Duke had been present in the drawing room that evening. He had been speaking to her father at the far end of the room about a wall that needed rebuilding. He had not, Eleanor would have sworn, been listening. She sat at her dressing table on the 7th morning of her marriage, and she looked at the yellow rose, and she thought, he is paying attention. And then, with the same clarity, he is paying attention, and he is choosing not to be seen doing it. She did not know yet what to do with that. It was not warmth. It was not exactly kindness. Kindness would have looked at her. It was something else. It was a kind of devotion that wore the clothing of indifference, and the indifference was not a costume she could easily forgive. She lifted the yellow rose and held it briefly to her face. The scent of her grandmother's garden filled her nose. Her eyes prickled once, and she set the rose down. "Mrs. Pell," she said, when the housekeeper came in, "would you ask the gardener to plant the same variety along the south wall? I should like to see it from my window." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Mrs. Pell?" "Your Grace?" "Tell him not to mention the request to His Grace." Mrs. Pell paused at the door. The grey eyes, which had seen a great many things in 50 years, noted the request and filed it. "Yes, Your Grace." The pattern continued for 10 weeks. Adrian Hartford did not eat with his wife. He did not sit with her in the drawing room after supper. He did not enter a room she was already in unless his sister was also present, and even then he stood near the window or near the door, never near the fire or the chair where Eleanor sat. He answered her questions in 3 sentences or fewer. He asked her none. He also, in those 10 weeks, ordered every romantic poet currently in print delivered to the library, where they appeared shelved in alphabetical order beside the Augustans he was supposed to prefer, replaced the cream brocade in the small drawing room with plain green linen identical to the footstool, arranged for the south fence, which had needed repair since his father's time, to be rebuilt during the 3rd week, so that the noise of the workmen would be over before Eleanor's first proper week of taking morning walks, and rode himself, twice in 1 week, to the village apothecary's to fetch the particular oil of bergamot Eleanor's lady's maid mentioned, in passing, to a footman, that her ladyship preferred for her hair. Eleanor knew all of this. She catalogued it. She catalogued also that his coat was always already brushed and waiting at 5:30 in the morning, suggesting a man who slept poorly and rose early. That he ate 1 full meal a day, at noon, alone in the steward's office, while pretending to dine on estate business. That he never closed the door to his study when he was working, and that the lamp in his bedroom, which she could see from her own window across the inner courtyard, burned until well past 1 in the morning, every single night. He was not sleeping. She was not certain why, but she knew he was not sleeping. She did not tell him she had noticed. She wrote instead to her younger sister, Charlotte, 3 times a week, a careful narrative of marriage in which her husband appeared as a brisk and proper figure, too occupied with estate business to dine, who treated her with respect from a distance. Eleanor did not lie. She simply did not write down the bergamot or the green linen, or the way Mrs. Pell had begun, after the 3rd week, to set the Duke's place at the breakfast table with 2 slices of lemon in his water, as well as Eleanor's, as though Mrs. Pell, who was an observer of long standing, had concluded something on the Duke's behalf that the Duke himself was not yet ready to declare. Eleanor noticed also that Mrs. Pell now smiled in private, faintly, only when she thought no one was looking. The first time Eleanor heard her husband laugh was in the 11th week. It was a cold spring evening. She had gone out to walk the south path because the rose canes had begun to leaf, and she wanted to see them. She came around the corner of the kitchen garden wall and stopped. The Duke was kneeling in the dirt. He had his coat off. His linen shirt was pushed up to the elbow on his right arm. His hands, long, capable, with a scar across the back of the left one she had never seen close enough to identify, were full of mud. He was sleeving in one of the new yellow rose canes she had asked for. The gardener was standing 2 paces behind him with a spade and an expression of patient indulgence. Eleanor did not move. She did not breathe loudly. She watched. The Duke said something to the gardener. The gardener answered. The Duke laughed. It was a low, brief, surprised sound. It came out of him as though he had not used the muscles for a long time and had forgotten the shape of the noise. The gardener grinned. The Duke shook his head, still laughing, and reached for the next cane. Then he looked up. He saw her. The laugh stopped. His face did the thing she had seen it do 100 times now. The careful smoothing, the closing, the polite distance assembling itself across his features, like a door being shut quietly. He stood up. He brushed his hands. He picked up his coat from the wheelbarrow. "Your Grace," he said. His voice was even. "Forgive me, I did not see you there." "His Grace was helping with the canes," the gardener said cheerfully, then caught the Duke's brief glance and remembered himself. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace." "Not at all." Eleanor's voice was as composed as she had ever heard it. She felt, beneath the composure, something dangerously close to laughter. "I came to see how they were taking. It seems they will do well." "I believe so, Your Grace." She nodded. She turned to go. She had walked perhaps 4 steps along the path when she heard, behind her, the small, specific sound of a man putting his coat back on, as though he had been caught by his sister, and the gardener saying, quietly enough that he could not be sure she would hear, "She'll like them, Your Grace." The Duke did not answer that. Eleanor walked on. She did not let herself look back. She did not let herself smile until she was inside the kitchen garden gate and out of sight. When she reached the house, she went directly to the library, where the fire was lit, and the green lamp was lit, and the leather chair nearest the fire was, as always, unoccupied, because she had never sat in it, and he had stopped sitting in it the day she came. She crossed the room, and she sat down in his chair. She sat in it for 2 full hours. She read 78 pages of Wordsworth. She drank 1 glass of brandy from his decanter, in his glass, with her feet tucked beneath her, in the manner she had been told all her life was unbecoming. When she went up to bed, she left the book open on the arm of the chair. She did not turn it face down. In the months that followed, she stopped counting the days. Not because the marriage had warmed. It had not in any visible way. He still did not eat with her. He still did not look at her across the breakfast table. He still left rooms quietly when she entered, except that now he sometimes hesitated at the door for half a second before going, as though balancing some decision he never resolved in her favor. She stopped counting because she had stopped waiting. She had begun, instead, to live. She rode in the mornings on a chestnut mare named Penelope she chose herself from the Duke's stables. She wrote to her sister and to 2 old friends from her London season. She read 3 books a week from her husband's library and left small light pencil marks in the margins beside the lines she liked best, because she had decided to leave evidence of herself in the house as he was leaving evidence of himself in her bedroom. Once, in the 7th month, she came down to find a passage of Cooper she had marked the previous afternoon, underlined a 2nd time, in a different hand, in ink. The hand was unhurried, slanted slightly to the right. Exactly the hand that signed estate documents on the front hall table. She did not mark anything else for a week. She wanted to see whether he would notice. He did. After 10 days, he left a Donne sonnet open on her writing desk in the morning room, with a single line underscored. "I have done one braver thing, / than all the worthies did, / and yet a braver thence doth spring, / which is, to keep that hid." She looked at the line for a long time. She read the sonnet to its conclusion. Then she walked to her writing desk and took down a sheet of paper and dipped her pen, and she wrote, in her own clear hand, a single line at the bottom. "Then I shall be braver than the worthies, Your Grace, and not keep mine hid." She left the page on the desk. She went out for her morning ride. When she came back, both the book and the paper were gone. That night, she heard him in the library across the corridor at 11:30 when she could not sleep. She heard the chair creak. She heard, once, the sound of him laughing, the same low, brief, surprised sound, and then a long silence. He did not come to her door. She had not expected him to. She had not, exactly, written that he should. She turned over and looked at the candle on her bedside table and watched it gutter. She thought, I am living inside a love letter. He is composing it around me. He will not put his name to it. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, then I shall sign mine first and force him to answer. Lord Carstairs' spring ball was held every year on the third Tuesday in April at Carstairs House in London, and was the first ball of the new season. Eleanor's invitation arrived in March of the year following her wedding. It was addressed, in the careful hand of Lord Carstairs' secretary, to His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere and Her Grace the Duchess of Ravensmere, and there were notes attached, suggesting that Her Grace's attendance was particularly desired, as the ball would be Lady Carstairs' first opportunity to formally welcome the Duchess to the Tun. It was the first social engagement of Eleanor's married life. She had been Duchess for nearly a year, and London had not yet seen her. Mrs. Pell brought the invitation on the silver tray to the morning room. The Duke was, as usual, not present. He was riding somewhere, or in the steward's office, or in any of the 100 small distances he had built between his life and his wife's. Eleanor read the invitation. She set it down. She looked up at Mrs. Pell. Mrs. Pell, will His Grace go? His Grace is Lord Lieutenant of the county, Your Grace. He attends every year. I see. And me? Mrs. Pell hesitated. I cannot say, Your Grace. His Grace has not mentioned the matter. Has the dressmaker been ordered? No, Your Grace. For me, I mean, by His Grace. No, Your Grace, not to my knowledge. Eleanor heard the small qualification at the end. She filed it. Then I shall order her myself, she said. Send to Madame Dufour in Bond Street and ask her to come to Ravensmere on Friday. I shall require 3 new gowns, 1 for the ball, 2 for day wear in town. Yes, Your Grace. That evening at supper, Eleanor's solitary supper, as always, a folded note appeared on the silver tray beside her wine-glass. She did not, at first, recognize the hand on it, and then she did, because she had been studying it in marginalia for months. She broke the seal. Your Grace, I have written to Madame Dufour. She comes Wednesday, with assistance. The colours should be your choice. The expense need not be. R. He signed it with the initial of his title, not his name. She did not know yet whether to be furious or to laugh. She did both, briefly, into her wine-glass, and then she folded the note and put it in her sleeve. She knew exactly what she would wear to the ball. She had known for 9 months. It would be ruby red. She would not be air anywhere near him, not on that night, not in front of London. Madame Dufour came on Wednesday with 2 assistants, 4 packing cases, 60 fabric samples, and the quiet, watchful manner of a woman who had dressed 3 royal duchesses and was paid to remember every preference she had ever observed. She unpacked her samples in Eleanor's dressing room. She opened the cases. She laid out 12 bolts of silk in graduated colours, and she stood back, and she folded her small, dark hands, and waited. Eleanor walked the length of the silks. She put her fingers on a deep green. She put her fingers on an ivory. She paused, briefly, on a saffron yellow that called to mind the rose canes along the south wall. She came to the ruby. It was the colour of garnets in candlelight, of pomegranate seeds on white china, of the inside of a fig. It was a colour a woman wore when she had decided, for one night, that she would not be discreet. This one, she said, for the ball gown. An excellent choice, Your Grace. Madame Dufour was already taking out her measuring ribbon. She paused, with the ribbon in her hand. Forgive me, Your Grace. May I ask, has His Grace expressed a preference? His Grace has not been consulted. His Grace's preferences are his own. Of course, Your Grace. There was the briefest small flicker at the corner of Madame Dufour's mouth. Not quite amusement. Not quite anything. It is only. His Grace, when he commissioned my services 9 months ago, requested that I keep 4 bolts of cloth in reserve, Your Grace, against the day his wife should have occasion for a court gown. Eleanor stilled. 4 bolts. In 4 colours, Your Grace. And those colours? Ivory, a deep green, a pale gold. Madame Dufour cleared her throat, the smallest cough. And a particular ruby red, Your Grace. He was specific about the shade. He said it should be, I believe his exact words were, the colour of garnets in candlelight. Eleanor sat down in the low chair near the window. She sat very carefully, the way a person sits down who has just been struck. When was this? She said. In June, Your Grace. Last June. Before... Forgive me, Your Grace. Before the wedding. You mean to say my husband ordered 4 bolts of silk reserved for me before he had married me? Yes, Your Grace. He paid for them at the time. He has since... Madame Dufour hesitated. He has since written to me at 3 other times to inquire whether the colours had faded in storage, and to direct that they be replaced if so, at his expense. I have replaced the ruby twice, Your Grace. He was particular that the shade should be exact. Eleanor put her hand on the arm of the chair. She looked down at the silk laid across her knees. The light from the window came through the weave and made the colour of it brighter and wilder than it had been on the table. Closer to a flame. Closer to a wound. Closer to a confession a man had been preparing for 9 months to receive, without ever speaking. Madame Dufour, Your Grace, you will measure me for the ruby, and the green, and the ivory and the gold, and 1 day gown for London in plain white muslin with cherry ribbons. I shall wear the ruby on the night of the ball. You will not at any point mention to His Grace that I asked you about the bolts, or that you told me. Is that understood? Yes, Your Grace. Madame Dufour bent her head. The flicker at the corner of her mouth had become, very briefly, an open smile. Entirely understood, Your Grace. Eleanor stood. She turned in the light. The ruby silk fell across her arm, and she held it as though she had at last found a weapon her size. She had been a year a duchess, in a house that pretended she was not in it. She would not be heir at the ball. She would be the fire. The journey to London took them 2 days. They travelled in separate carriages. The Duke had, with a polite note delivered to her dressing room on the morning of departure, suggested it would be more convenient for both of them, given the volume of luggage and the requirements of the route. Eleanor had read the note. She had thought about it for a quarter of an hour, sitting at her dressing table with the yellow rose at her elbow and the invitation propped against the mirror. Then she had taken her pen and written back. Your Grace, as you wish. I shall expect, however, that we travel together for the final mile into town, so that London may see us arrive as a married pair. I am sure you would agree this is necessary. E. She signed it with her initial, as he had signed his note to her. She sent it down with her maid. A reply came within the hour. Your Grace, you are entirely correct. I shall transfer to your carriage at the Highgate Gate. R. She laughed quietly to herself, alone in her room. He was incapable of saying yes, warmly. He was, she suspected, capable of meaning yes, warmly. The distance between the two was the distance she had been teaching herself all year to bridge alone. He kept the appointment at Highgate Gate. He climbed into her carriage with his greatcoat over his arm. He sat down on the seat opposite her, not beside her. He looked at his hands. He looked out of the window. He looked, for the first time in nearly a year, briefly, at her. She was wearing the white muslin with the cherry ribbons. Her hair was simply dressed. She was not yet the woman of the ruby gown. She was the ordinary morning version of his wife. And his eyes, when they reached her, did the thing she had learned to watch for. They took her in, all of her, with the quick, comprehensive sweep of a man cataloguing every detail. Then they slid sideways. Then they returned to his hands. Have you been well, Your Grace? He said. Very well, Your Grace. And yourself? Adequately. That was the entire conversation across the last mile of the road into Mayfair. They arrived at Hertford House in Grosvenor Square together, in the same carriage, and the footman handed her down, and the Duke offered her his arm to walk up the steps. She took it. His arm was tense beneath her glove. He smelled of bergamot and wet slate, and, faintly, of the brandy he had clearly taken before transferring carriages. She filed that, too. "Tomorrow night," she said, on the steps, low enough that only he could hear. "I shall be expected to dance." "Yes." "With whom?" "Whomever asks, I imagine. It is a ball." "And if you are asked to dance with your wife, Your Grace?" He paused, with his hand on the door. She felt the pause through his sleeve. "Then I shall dance with my wife," he said. He did not look at her as he said it. He opened the door and walked her into the hall, and Mrs. Pell, who had come up to London ahead of them, was waiting with the staff, and the moment was over. But he had said it. She had made him say it. She put it away for tomorrow. The Carstairs ball began at 9 o'clock on the third Tuesday in April. By 9:30 the rooms were full. By 10 the floor was crowded. By 10:30 Eleanor had been introduced to Lady Carstairs, to 2 royal duchesses, to the Russian ambassador, to 4 marchionesses, to 7 dowagers of varying severity, and to a small, watchful section of the ton who had not yet seen her in the year of her marriage, and who had, very obviously, been waiting to. She wore the ruby gown. It had been cut low at the shoulder and high at the waist, in the new fashion, with a single narrow gold cord beneath the bust. Her hair was up. She wore her grandmother's pearls. She wore long gloves to the elbow in an ivory so pale it read as cream against the red. She was, every gentleman in the room would say afterward, the most striking woman at the ball. Her husband, when she came down the great staircase at Hertford House before the carriage ride to Carstairs, had stopped at the foot of the stairs with his hand on the newel post. He had looked at her. He had not looked away. He had looked at her, all of her, slowly, with an expression that Eleanor, who had spent a year learning to read his face from sidelong glances and the angle of his jaw, recognized at once as the expression of a man who had been preparing for 9 months to see this exact thing, and had, even so, miscalculated his defenses against it. He said only, "Your Grace." "Your Grace." He had handed her into the carriage. He had not spoken on the drive. He had walked her into Carstairs' house on his arm and announced her name to Lord Carstairs himself, and then, the moment courtesy permitted, drifted to the edge of the room, where he took up a position by a tall window and remained there. He did not ask her to dance. He did not approach the floor. He spoke to 2 members of the Lords with whom he had committee business. He spoke to his godfather. He took 1 glass of wine and did not finish it. He watched. Eleanor saw it. She did not look directly at him. She did not have to. She knew the precise angle of the window where he stood, the precise tilt of his head, the precise set of his shoulders. She had been watching him for a year through 100 different doors. She did not need to turn her face to find him in the room. She danced with 2 lords, with the heir to the Carstairs title, with a young naval captain home on leave, and with her godfather. Each man asked. She accepted. She danced beautifully, the way a steel rose dances, with a precision and lightness that surprised partners who had been told, by gossip, that the Duchess of Ravensmere was a country girl whose husband had married down. She did not look once at the window. At 11 o'clock, the 3rd set ended. There was a brief pause, the floor cleared, the orchestra retuned. Eleanor stood near the central pillar, accepting a glass of lemonade from a footman, and she heard, from her left, "Your Grace, forgive my forwardness, but I believe Lady Carstairs' musicians are about to begin a waltz, and I have been told, as a man who has been abroad, that it is the first waltz of the season. Would you do me the honour?" She turned. Lord Ashby stood at her elbow. He was tall, fair, with a sun-darkened face from his recent return from Vienna, and he was bowing with the easy grace of a man who had spent the last 3 years among the most accomplished dancers in Europe. He was perhaps 30. He was, Eleanor noted with a small detached interest, extremely handsome. He was also a stranger to her. She heard, in the small silence that followed his question, the tiny ripple of attention move through the watching crowd. The Duchess of Ravensmere, who had been at her own ball without dancing with her husband. Lord Ashby, recently returned from Vienna. The first waltz of the season. She heard, from the window, although there was no actual sound, her husband stop breathing. She lifted her chin. "Lord Ashby, the pleasure is mine." She set down her lemonade. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor. The orchestra began. It was the first waltz Eleanor had danced in a public ballroom in her life. The waltz had been considered too forward for unmarried women in her last season, and she had been a country wife since. But she had been taught, painstakingly, by her aunt, on a parquet floor in Hampshire, with all the windows shut and a cousin watching the door, and she remembered every step. Lord Ashby was an excellent partner. He held her at the precise distance the new fashion permitted. His hand at her waist was warm, but utterly correct. He spoke pleasantly as they turned, about Vienna, about the difference between Austrian waltzes and English ones, about the first time he had seen the dance done well by people who did not look mortified. He made her laugh, twice. He made her, briefly, forget there were 500 people in the room. She did not look at the window, but on the 7th turn, when her back was nearly to the place where her husband had been standing, she felt, rather than saw, the column of attention behind her shift. She felt a man cross a room. She felt, in the way a deer in a wolf feels a wolf, a presence detach itself from the wall and move along the edge of the floor toward her. She did not turn her head. She kept dancing. The 8th turn brought her around. The Duke of Ravensmere stood at the edge of the dance floor, with one hand on the back of a chair, and the knuckles of that hand white. His face was composed. His face was so composed, it was a face from a portrait. Every line of it correct, every muscle settled, every degree of polite attention exactly calibrated to a man watching his wife dance with another man at a public ball. His eyes were not composed. Eleanor, who had spent a year of her life teaching herself to read the small flickers in his face from across rooms, saw what was in his eyes. She had, it turned out, never had to imagine it. It was there now. The dance ended. Lord Ashby bowed. He returned her to her place near the pillar. He thanked her with the particular gravity of a man who had enjoyed himself entirely and was professional enough not to push. He left her with a word, a small smile and a nod, and went to ask the daughter of the Russian ambassador for the next dance. He had been a perfectly ordinary partner. He had asked her once. He had been, as he was meant to be, kind. The Duke crossed the room. He did not run. He did not hurry. He walked the length of Carstairs House's principal ballroom, between knots of staring guests, with his eyes on his wife and on no one else, and he did not stop until he was directly in front of her. "Your Grace," he said. His voice was so quiet that the people 2 paces away had to lean to hear it. The orchestra had begun again, another waltz. The floor was filling. He bowed. "Will you dance?" he said. It was not exactly a question. She looked at him. She had been waiting, and she did not know it, for 1 entire year, for him to ask her this in this voice, with these eyes. "Yes." He took her hand. His hand was cold beneath her glove. His other hand, when it found her waist, was steady but not soft. The grip of a man whose self-command was the only thing keeping him intact. He led her into the figure. The orchestra carried them. He did not speak for the first turn. On the second, with his eyes on the air over her right shoulder, and his voice so low only she could hear it, he said, "Not here. Please, not here." She understood at once. "The terrace," she said. "After this set." Yes. He danced with her without a single misstep. He danced with her with the careful, exact, devastating attention of a man who had memorized her measurements, who knew the exact rotation of her waist, who had been holding this distance for 9 months by an act of will, and was, finally, holding it because she had told him to. They moved through the crowd. They moved through the watching eyes of the Tun. They moved, eventually, through the open glass doors at the far end of the ballroom and out onto the terrace. The night air was cold. A moon was up. Below them, the gardens of Carstairs House fell away in a series of stone steps to a fountain and a yew hedge. There was no one on the terrace, except a single liveried footman, who saw the Duke and his Duchess, and removed himself with great speed. Adrian Hartford turned to face his wife. He did not let go of her hand. Eleanor. It was the first time he had said her given name aloud since the morning of their wedding, when the priest had required it. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian. Adrian. He closed his eyes for the briefest second. He opened them. Forgive me, he said. She did not answer immediately. She was looking at his face. She was looking at it the way a woman looks at a letter she has been reading for a year and has finally been permitted to turn the last page over. For which thing, she said. I shall need you to specify, Your Grace. Adrian. There is rather a long list. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the same low, surprised sound she had heard once in the rose garden. He did not let go of her hand. Begin where you like, he said. I shall apologize for them in any order you prefer. Then we shall begin with the bergamot oil. 2 visits in 1 week to the village apothecary, when the steward could perfectly have sent for it. Why, Adrian? He looked at her. Because if I sent the steward, you might never know it was there. And the green linen on the footstool. You said in March, in your father's drawing room, that you preferred plain stuffs to ornamented ones. Your sister was teasing you. You laughed. I do not remember saying that. You remembered it. I remember everything you have ever said in my hearing. I have been, extremely careful. And the 4 bolts of silk, Adrian. He looked away. The composure cracked. She saw the small, specific muscle in his jaw move. Madame Dufour told you. Madame Dufour is a very accurate dressmaker. I asked her to keep them. I told myself it was prudent, that if you should require... He stopped. He looked back at her. That is not the truth. The truth is I imagined you in that ruby in June, before I had any right to imagine you in anything, and I could not bear the thought that the dye would fade. You imagined me in this gown 9 months before our wedding? Yes. And you did not, in the year of our marriage, look at me long enough to confirm the imagining? No. Why? He was silent for a long moment. Behind them, through the glass doors, the orchestra was ending the waltz. Inside, the laughter and the hum of voices rose. On the terrace, the air was cold enough that her breath was visible. His was too. Because, he said at last, you did not choose me. She waited. You signed the contract because your father and I made it. You came to Ravensmere because you had no other home. I had loved you across 2 drawing rooms and a dinner party before you knew I had memorized your name. And you came to my house because you had to, and I could not bear. I could not. He stopped. His voice was not steady. I could not look at you as my wife, knowing you had not chosen me. I could not stand to see in your face that you were enduring me. I told myself, God forgive me, I told myself if I was absent enough, you might at least be free of me inside the marriage. You might have your life. You might forgive me, eventually, for marrying you. Adrian. And every day I made it worse. Every yellow rose, every book, every gown ordered without your consent. I have built around you for a year a house of attentions you did not ask for and could not refuse. And tonight, when you walked down the staircase in that ruby gown, I knew. I have known for months. I could not. He stopped again. You could not what? I could not bear to see another man dance with you. She let go of his hand. She did it carefully. She did it without anger. She held his hand gently at the wrist for 1 beat, and then released it. And she stepped back so that the full ruby of her gown was visible to him in the moonlight. and she folded her gloved hands in front of her exactly the way she had folded them in the chapel 12 months ago, when he had held his hand out to her, and she had refused it.
Adrian.
Yes. You are quite certain it would have been kinder, on the morning of our wedding, to leave me alone for a year inside a house full of evidence of your devotion, than to sit down beside me at the breakfast table and say, "I am afraid you do not love me." You are quite certain that was the kinder course. No. Speak it. It was not kinder. It was cowardice. And the easier for me. It was cowardice. And the silk in storage, and the rose canes, and the Wordsworth. Cowardice. All of it. And tonight, Eleanor, Adrian, speak it. Tonight you saw another man take my hand, and you crossed the room. Why? Because I've loved you for 19 months, and I cannot any longer pretend to be a man who has not. She closed her eyes. The cold air of the terrace went into her lungs and stayed there. When she opened her eyes, he was still standing where he had stood, with his hands now at his sides, with the moonlight on his face, looking at her the way she had refused for a year to let herself believe he could look. "Then this," she said quietly, "is what I shall require." Anything. Do not say anything. Listen first. She drew breath. "I shall require, Your Grace, that you speak to me at breakfast tomorrow. Not in two-sentence answers, in sentences of any length you choose. I shall require that you tell me, one at a time, every observation you have made of me in the past 19 months, until the catalogue is empty. Yes. I shall require that you eat your noon meal with me, in my dining room, at my left hand. I shall require that the footstool in the small drawing room be moved beside your chair, not mine, because it is comfortable, and I will not have it relegated to my use only. Yes. I shall require, on Wednesdays, that you read to me from the Wordsworth in the library, and on Thursdays, that I read to you from whatever I choose, including, if I choose, the romantics whom you dislike. I shall require that you cease, this very hour, the habit of leaving rooms when I enter them. Yes. I shall require, if I dance with another man, that you ask me for the next dance, but not because I cannot dance with anyone but you, because you would like to. Do you understand me, Adrian? Yes. And one further thing. Yes. You will say my name to me, by which I mean my given name, every time you address me in private. You have used it once tonight. You may use it again. You may use it as often as you have been silently using it for a year. You may, in fact, use it with profligacy, Your Grace, until it ceases to feel like a confession and starts to feel like a habit. Eleanor. Yes. I shall require something also. Speak it. That you not be heir with me ever again. I have lived inside a marriage with the heir for a year. I have hated every hour of it. I do not, I will not do it again. She looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then she crossed the small space of the terrace between them. She did not put her hand on his arm. She put her gloved hand on his face, on the side of his jaw, and he closed his eyes against her palm, as though her hand were the first warm thing he had touched in his life. And he turned his face into it, briefly, before he opened his eyes again. I shall not, she said. I am not heir. I have never been heir. I have been here, Your Grace, the entire year. Adrian. I have been here the entire time. I know. I know you know. That is the entire trouble. He laughed, finally. It was the third time she had ever heard him do it. It was not surprised this time. It was something else. Something closer to exhausted. Something closer to relieved. Something closer to a man waking from a fever and discovering the room is still there, and the lamp is still lit, and his wife has been sitting beside the bed the whole time. Eleanor, he said, when you come back inside with me. In a moment. In a moment. There is one more dance in this set. We shall dance it. Then we shall go into supper. Then we shall make the rounds my godfather has been hinting all night that we should make. Then we shall go home. And tomorrow at breakfast, Your Grace, you shall begin telling me the catalogue. We have a great deal of it to get through. Yes. He held out his hand to her again, the way he had held it out at the altar 12 months ago. This time, she took it. The remainder of the ball is not, in truth, the part of the story that interests us most. But the Tun interests itself easily, and so the rest must be told. When the Duke and Duchess returned to the ballroom, visibly, conspicuously, hand in hand, with no attempt at concealment, there was a perceptible adjustment in the room. A great many faces turned. A great many fans rose to mouths. Lady Crandall, the most assiduous of the season's dowager observers, was heard to remark to her sister-in-law that Ravensmere's wife, after a year of obscurity, appeared to have made an entrance after all. Her sister-in-law, who had a more accurate eye, noted that it was the Duke who had been absent for a year, and that his wife had merely chosen tonight to make the fact public. The orchestra began the next waltz. The Duke and Duchess danced. It was during this dance that Lord Mortlake, a man who had been a rejected suitor of Eleanor's the year before her wedding, who carried his rejection as a personal grievance, and who had been waiting since he learned of her marriage for an opportunity to extract a small social satisfaction, chose to make his move. He intercepted them between dances near the supper room. He bowed elaborately. He congratulated the Duke on his fortune, in a tone calibrated to suggest the opposite. He observed, with the careful mockery of a man with a thin advantage, that the Duchess had been remarkably hidden in the country for a full year, and that some had begun to speculate as to whether the Duke had concealed her on purpose, or whether, he allowed himself a thin smile, the lady herself had not quite been suited to society after all. It was a clever insult. It implicated both of them, and it required either of them to defend the other publicly to refute it. Eleanor felt her husband begin, beside her, to draw himself up into the cold mask he had worn for a year. She put her hand on his sleeve. She turned to Lord Mortlake. She smiled the small, exact smile of a steel rose, preparing to dissect. Lord Mortlake, how kind of you to inquire. I have indeed been in the country for a year. I have been, as it happens, restoring the rose gardens at Ravensmere, a project rather close to my heart. I understand you yourself are something of a horticulturist. Yes, Your Grace, I have a small interest. How delightful. Then perhaps you can advise me. I have been told that the Mortlake variety of yellow tea rose is no longer in cultivation in England, and that the remaining canes were sold to a French nursery before the war. Is this correct? There was the smallest possible pause. Lord Mortlake had not, in fact, been told that. He had heard rumours. He had heard, more particularly, that his late father had sold the variety in some financial difficulty that the family did not discuss. It is. I have established, through correspondence with the nursery in Lyon, that the variety still survives. They are sending me cuttings in May. I shall be happy to provide your gardens with cuttings of your own family's rose, my lord, when they have rooted. I had quite assumed, of course, that you would already be in possession of them yourself. The crowd around them had grown quieter. People were listening. Lord Mortlake's colour rose. Most kind, Your Grace. Not at all. We must always preserve the heritage of our great families, must we not? It is, after all, the only thing distinguishing them, over time, from the merely ordinary. She let the sentence land. She then turned, before he could answer, to her husband, and in a perfectly conversational voice said, Adrian, my dear, would you take me into supper? I find I am rather hungry. The Duke, who had stood through the entire exchange with his hand under hers, and his face quite composed, said, With pleasure, Your Grace, and walked her past Lord Mortlake into the supper room without looking back. The next morning, 3 London papers carried a brief account of the Duchess's first ball. 2 of the 3 referred to her as spectacular. All 3 printed Lord Mortlake's name. He did not appear in society for the remainder of the season. They left London at the end of the week. They travelled in the same carriage. They stopped, of their own choosing, at an inn on the second evening and took private rooms. And the Duke, for the first time in their marriage, did not retire to a separate chamber. They returned to Ravensmere on the 17th of April, 2 days after the first anniversary of their wedding. The yellow roses along the south wall were beginning to bud. It is here that the story, properly speaking, ends. There is a wedding to be re-blessed, since the first one was not, in the Duke's opinion, a real wedding. He had been present in body and absent in soul, which is no marriage at all. And he insisted on returning to the chapel 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in May, and standing again before the priest, and this time taking his wife's hand and meaning it. The priest, who had known the Duke since he was a boy of 7, and who had said his first wedding under considerable strain, was happy to oblige. The witnesses this time were the Duke's sister, Mrs. Pell, the gardener, and Eleanor's younger sister, Charlotte, who had been informed by post of the entire situation and had laughed for 10 minutes before bursting into tears and writing back that she would, of course, attend, but that she expected the Duke to apologize for an entire year of unhappy letters. He did. She accepted. She liked him very much from that day forward. But these are details, and the story is, properly, complete. What remains is a single image. 6 months after the ball, on a cold morning in October, Eleanor walked along the corridor at Ravensmere Hall. She was on her way to the breakfast room. She passed the library door. The library door was open. The fire was lit. The green lamp was lit. The 2 leather chairs were drawn up before the fire. The chair he had always sat in, and the chair beside it, which had been his father's, and which she had chosen, weeks ago, as her own. A small footstool in plain green linen sat between them. He was already there. He had a cup of coffee at his elbow. He was reading a letter. He looked up when she passed. He did not slide his eyes away. He did not return them to his hands. He looked at her face, full on, unembarrassed, with the quiet, absorbed attention of a man who had spent a year teaching himself not to do this, and had, at last, given it up. He smiled. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Good morning, Adrian." He held out his hand. She crossed the room. She took it. She sat down beside him in the chair that had once been his father's, and she put her feet on the green linen footstool, and she leaned her head, for a moment, only a moment, the morning was busy and the day was about to begin, against his shoulder. He smelled of bergamot and wet slate. The yellow rose on the side table was, she noticed, the first one of the autumn's second flowering. He had cut it himself. There was a small scratch on the back of his hand where the thorn had caught him. She put her finger gently on the scratch. He did not flinch. "You ought to wear gloves," she said. "I know." "You won't, though." "I won't." The fire crackled. The clock in the hall struck 9. Through the window, somewhere, a thrush was singing in the wet October garden. "Adrian." "Eleanor." "I am not heir." "No, my love. You are not. You never were." He kissed the top of her head. She closed her eyes briefly against his shoulder. The yellow rose dropped one petal onto the table beside them, and neither of them moved to pick it up. This is the way the story ends. Not with a wedding, and not with a ball, and not even with a confession on a cold terrace under a moon. It ends on a Tuesday morning in October, in a quiet library, with a man who has finally learned to look at his wife when she comes into the room, and a wife who has finally learned that she did not need to teach him to. She had only ever needed to wait until he was brave enough to do it himself. If this story warmed your evening, please leave a comment with one line, any line, that stayed with you. I read every one. And if you would like more stories like this, slow, patient, full of weather and wallpaper, and the particular silences between 2 people who are trying, at last, to be honest, subscribe and stay close to the fire. There will be a new one soon.